Okay, we welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is a show where we profile a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. In each episode of this show, we have a guest who has a unique story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new definition of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest on our show. In today's show or today's episode, I have another friend, a close friend, Giada Ferucci, who I've known closely for the last year and a half, if I'm right. Giada, yeah.
Yes.
We worked together on a couple of projects, and just to give you a little background about her work up to now, Giada is a PhD student in media studies at Western University. She has a BA in Economic Development and International Cooperation from the University of Florence in Italy. She also has an MA in International Relations from Aarhus University in Denmark. Her doctoral research focuses on social movements and environmental activism and how they translate into policy. Her research interests include environmental communication, media activism, social movements, and access to information on environmental justice matters, with a particular focus on the Latin American region. Currently, she is working as a research assistant for the project Surviving Memory in Post-War El Salvador. This is a collaborative research initiative to document the Salvadorian Civil War, which went on from 1980 to 1992. So that's a little background about Jada. But me and Jada worked on the El Salvador Surviving Memory project together, and it was a wonderful experience. And we're close friends because of that professional collaboration. But I was always curious about your journey, Jada, in terms of how you took all these decisions in your life, but also got to where you are now, because you have moved several times, not only across countries, but also across continents for the work you do. But Jada, I'm curious about where all of this started, and what was Jada like growing up as a child and in Florence in Italy. So maybe we could get started there if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Avi. And it's nice to be here talking with a friend, but also, just sharing maybe some details that I haven't yet had the chance to talk about with you. So, I was born and grew up in Florence, and I've known same people all my life. The mentality of it there is not as open-minded as one would think. So I've always been pretty curious. That's a way I would describe myself ever since I was in primary school, probably, and always yearning for something, something different, something that I had not experienced yet. And that's why I felt like as long as I would stay in Florence, I would never grow up, or at least I would never start a life of my own. So growing up, I was, you know, little timid, pretty studious, and I had a great passion for documentaries. So actually, I think that's one of the things that shaped me the most, like research and presenting information in a way that is compelling and appealing. I used to dream to and I wanted to become a documentarist, and I haven't been able to do that yet. But I
Hmm.
think certain skills that I learned to master throughout the years of my professional experience and my education, maybe one day will lead me there. So while most of kids were, really into cartoons and stuff, and so was I, but I also had this incredible interest for documentaries and history.
Yeah.
And I think that really shaped a lot of my hobbies and interests growing up through middle school, high school, and when I had to choose which program I wanted to enroll for my bachelor degree, I had to compromise. Sadly, we all know, even though it's absolutely unfair, that humanities and even social sciences sometimes are not as valued as the STEM. So, despite my desire of studying history, I tried to compromise, and I found that I also like geography a lot. In the program that I enrolled in international cooperation and economic development, I thought it was a sensible option, a compromise between my real passion and something that could lead to a career.
Hmm.
And it was a good experience, but it didn't leave me too much in terms of growing or skills. Education in Italy at the university level is based a lot on memorization,
Hmm.
which I think is good in many ways because I do find myself having a good memory even now when I talk to people or when I read an article. But I felt like I need to experience something new, and I moved abroad. I went to Denmark to complete my master, and it took me 1 year gap where I was working like seasonal jobs between my bachelor degree and my master, and it was probably one of the worst periods of my life to be without a direction, to be without a purpose. And if I think back, I'm honestly so surprised because it was 5 years and a half ago. Yet it feels like a lifetime. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, but I'm so glad I went to Denmark because even though it wasn't always, roses and rainbows, it allowed me to grow a lot. It allowed me to improve my English. I finally was able to leave my home with the support of my parents, to whom I'm extremely grateful. But for me, it was a starting step to become my own person, an independent thinker and professional, and finally become who I am today, which I'm sure is going to change throughout the years. But so far, I think I owe a lot to the experience of going abroad, studying in a different country, same continent, still slightly different from my home country, and that led to many other experiences
Yeah.
because while I was in Denmark, actually, I completed an internship as part of my program in El Salvador. And that was like the life changing experience, something completely random, I would say. I find that randomness sometimes has been a defining element of my life. And chaos is such an important element as well. And I think we often are raised with the idea that we need to be always in control,
Hmm.
and we always need to make plans, and we always need to uh, prepare contingency plans as well, but pretty much follow a straight line. But I found myself completely surprised because I grew up learning with some limitations English and French. I didn't know Spanish, but when I decided to do this internship, I had to learn Spanish in a few months before moving to El Salvador. Over there, I met my current supervisor. I started to know this project that I'm involved with and that Abby has been involved with as well. And that led me to come to Western because my supervisor was teaching and is still teaching at this university. So whenever people ask me, how come you got here in Canada? I would describe it as a very convoluted trip, a trip that started in Italy, went to Denmark, had a bit of a period of time in El Salvador, and eventually led me to Canada. So almost like a reverse and shape, one would say. And so that's, in not so many few words, something to say about uh, what I think shaped my childhood and moved and evolved along the way in my years growing up as an adolescent and then a young woman. And I still think of myself as a young woman, even though I'm almost 30. But I think there's so much still for me out there that I'm actually starting to feel a bit restless. I need to go somewhere else. I need to challenge myself again. After 3 years in the same country, I think soon is going to be time for me to explore somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that it's so amazing how you summarize such your whole life in like a couple of minutes, right, Jada? But I think there's so much more to break down in that narrative in terms of your passion for documentary filmmaking, for instance. That's something I thought you'd be interested in it, but I didn't know it was like something you were actually very curious about growing up. But were there any films you saw as a young girl growing up in Florence that you were particularly inspired by? Also, was Florence in some way a setting that inspired your thinking? Because it's a very culturally rich environment in terms of the museums and all the other art galleries, or I mean just the spaces you have in that city. It's very historically, it's an important art space in the world, and an important tourist destination too. So just a little bit about some of those documentary films and maybe something about how Florence influenced you growing up.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's father and son. They're father and son scientists in Italy that have been broadcasting documentaries since the 70s with the father, and then the son is continuing, and the father as well. And the son is a paleontologist, and they used to have weekly programs, and they covered a variety of historical facts and science discoveries. I've always been partial to historical documentaries for the reason that I've said, but it was also interesting, to find out more about the universe or how the human body works. And so they've had throughout the decades different programs. One was called Ulysses, I would say, The Pleasure of Discovery. Yeah, that's how I would translate it. And I know it's gonna sound very entitled, but when I was a young child, I read the Odyssey comics version, obviously, like with a bit of prose, but and I've always felt such a kinship to Ulysses, even though I'm not nearly as brave. But the way he was so smart, I wouldn't say even clever, but smart, like someone that in an unexpected solution always find unexpected situation, always comes up with a creative solution. The way he was brave, daring, curious. I've always liked that and always wished I could emulate it and become one myself. But yeah, those programs, I think they were so interesting because the way they were framing important questions about a particular historical figure or scientific discovery made it approachable and just educated people in a way that I think a book sometimes can't, just because it feels like a different effort. You'd rather spend 1 hour watching a documentary about Pluto than maybe reading a chapter from a textbook, even though probably they convey the same information. The format is completely different. And so it was a way of teaching that I found very interesting. And in that period of time also, it wasn't a documentary film, but another film that shaped me. And now I know it's gonna sound silly because it's not like this profound movie, but it was The Mummy. And I really wanted to become an Egyptologist as well among my dreams, but my deep fear of snakes and mummies and curses prevented me from following that dream. So maybe in another lifetime, but again, like it was the historical element that always fascinated me so much. And as you rightfully said, growing up in Florence meant that I was surrounded by art and architecture all my life. That's how I often describe living in Florence, like breathing art, culture, and architecture everywhere you go. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful to have been raised in a city that it's so beautiful. And we have a common joke over there about water, actually, because there was a period of time, actually a pretty long one, several centuries, I would say, between the late decades of Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. And the Renaissance was born in Florence. And the joke was that there was something special in the water in Florence because so many intellectuals, so many geniuses, one would say, came from Florence. And it was amazing, such a thriving period of time for arts and engineering and architecture and sculpture. And I really like the fact that back in the days, there were no labels, there were no restrictions. So if I think back of some of the main figures like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, they were everything. They were engineers, they were sculptors, they were painters, they were inventors. They had so many different skills and no boundaries. And it was great and almost unthinkable today. At the same time, I'm also aware, growing up and becoming exposed to many more countries and cultures that have had a very Eurocentric perspective. So while I still think that Florence is the best and the Renaissance is the greatest moment in history, and we've had a lot of geniuses, I am trying to disengage myself with a mentality where everything that comes from my place is better by default, and is the best. And sometimes that is a bit hard to handle, like when I have to admit that maybe something that we discovered turned out that we didn't discover maybe in Florence or invented it in Italy. It was maybe something that we stole from other countries. And it's again the Eurocentric side of my personality that has to fight with that, because it's like, oh no, I just cannot imagine it, because everything that I was raised with this idea that a lot of great things came from my place, and to imagine that ownership wasn't really treated carefully, it's something we have to consider, but it could be hard to engage with it sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, and it's really interesting that you acknowledge that as well, right? Rather, it's just this process of learning and unlearning where we come from. And one thing I always admired and appreciated about you, Jada, is you're so accepting and curious about the people around you, and that comes across in your personality and demeanor. But you also have a passion for languages, and I know you speak Italian, French, Spanish, English, and is there another language you speak apart from these four, Jada?
A little bit of Danish, but usually I don't say it because I think in order to speak a language, I would need to be, able to have a conversations and express my thoughts, maybe in a not so sophisticated way. And sadly, I started with Danish, but I stayed there only 10 months because the
Yeah.
coursework for my master program was only 10 months. And the English level over there is amazing.
Mm,
You could easily live all
survive.
your life in the, yeah, even live in Denmark all your life without learning the language. But then again, you really don't want that. You want to integrate yourself in the society, hopefully. And
Yeah, and the fact that you know so many languages, I remember a conversation we had where you told me that you also worked as a tour guide support person in Florence during one of the summers where you got to meet people coming in from different parts of the world. And I'm just curious about this passion for languages and how that's opened up your thinking, because I feel like every time you know another language, you get access to another culture in terms of understanding a different way of thinking. And I think the fact that you know like four different or five different languages gives you the opportunity to understand conversations in these different cultures. And I think it helps also build your perspective as a researcher in the current perspective, because a lot of your research is in a country where Spanish is the primary language of communication. And I know Italian is your first language. So I'm curious, is that in terms of languages, what is the language you dream and think in, or like dream and think in? And what is the language you enjoy reading and communicating in? So just your thoughts on languages for now.
yeah, no, those are all great questions. And I am so grateful that I had the opportunity of learning different languages. And I think you're right. They do open up perspectives, way of thinking that are completely different. While the languages that I've learned are pretty much from the same group, the Indo-European, then again, some are Germanic, some are Romance languages. So I think it's really important because it can only strengthen, your knowledge if and your brain muscles, one would say, if you try and practice learning a new language. There's work purposes, but there's also tourist or even culture. I know that across the world, many people want to learn Italian, and that's definitely not for like the utility in the sense of how many people speak this language, or is it so important. It's more like the culture. They want to approach food, music, and art in a way that helps them relate to it. And if I could, I would want to learn all the languages in the world, but sadly I can't. But it's been an interesting experience because I think most of my compatriots would agree with me. The way we teach foreign languages in Italy is not always the most effective. Oftentimes, it relies so much on translation that I think it still influenced my thinking process, my dreaming process. So I'm not fully conscious, but I still I'm pretty sure I still think and dream in Italian with the
Mhm.
occasional moment in English, maybe, but I'm definitely not there yet. And so growing up, even though I started learning English in primary school, it was it was what it was. Basically, it wasn't anything too articulated or really useful. I started learning French in middle school because back then it was the second foreign language that was the most popular. Nowadays, I would say more students are picking up either Spanish or Chinese, but back then, we're talking about 14 years ago, probably more. Wow,
Mhm.
yeah, 15 or 16 anyway. And so I started learning French. Again, same experience. The professors I've had, some were amazing, some were not as much, so I had to pick up a lot of the work on my own, doing external exams in order to foster the understanding of that language. I moved to Denmark, and even though I wasn't required to because my classes were in English, again for the reasons you were saying as well, I felt like I wanted to try and learn the local language, and it was amazing how good I had become in speaking the language and how terrible I was in understanding it. At least in the oral communication, like I would be in the train and not understand a single word. But then when I was in class with other people learning Danish, I could carry a decent conversation. So it was really not usual. And I think the reason why my experience in Denmark hasn't always been the best, even though I think it's a great country and I really liked it in many ways, the fact that I didn't speak the local language, I think, prevented me from enjoying a lot of different cultural aspects. And maybe if I'd stayed a little longer, I think it would have been better. But with the anchor of English, it was so easy to rely on that and not maybe make an effort. I did,
Mhm.
but again, and then Spanish came into my life pretty randomly because I never learned the Spanish in my school years, and I was 23 when I started. No, actually, I was 24, and I could be presumptuous enough to think, okay, I'll study this language by myself for 3, 4 months, and then I'll move to a Spanish-speaking country and be able to work and survive, as you said. And I did. And even to this day, I still get a lot of compliments for my Spanish and especially for my learning process. And I would like to say, oh, yes, I am that intelligent, I am that smart. But truth to be told, is they're different and it's not like easy, but it's definitely easier to learn that language from my linguistic background. So I always tell to my many Latin American friends, if you put yourself in the same situation but reverse languages, trying to learn Italian from a Spanish background, you do it too. And
Mm.
I think it's important to stress that because, again, depending on the context I am in, sometimes I'm surrounded by people that speak one language, sometimes by people who speak two, but sometimes I have people that speak five or six, and because maybe some are regional dialects of their own country, they're not seen as
Definitely.
lucrative, as important, or even the effort they made in order to learn the language is a little downplayed.
Mm.
And that I think is also part of my trying to break down that Eurocentric supremacy I was telling you about, because Europeans, they love to brag about the fact that they speak often 3, 4 languages that are very different from each other. And I think it's a great achievement, but then you shouldn't look down to someone from a different country in the world who has the knowledge of the same number of languages. And just because they're in the same country doesn't mean that those dialects or languages would be similar. And I know from your experience when you told to me about your native language from the part of India you're from, and then you have Hindi. Just because they're in the same country doesn't mean that it's so easy that you shouldn't reward people.
Yeah.
And yeah, I even wrote an article recently for the New Canadian Media about it, about bilingualism in Canada. And with so many newcomers who have to learn English in the first place, asking them for a bilingualism in French, it could be tricky because most often newcomers are already bilingual, multilingual.
Mhm.
But there's different degrees, where English and French are the top of the ladder, And if you're not bilingual in those, then you always slide further down. So I think it's another layer of complexity that we approach when learning languages, when deciding which languages we want to learn. And I wish things were different. I wish there was a more equality, or at
Mhm.
least working towards that goal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, those are great observations, Jada, because I think about my experience as well, and I think we've discussed this before. A lot of people from South Asia often speak a couple of different languages. In India, for instance, you have your state language, a national language, and English, and then you also speak the languages around your state because there's a lot of internal movement within India from one state to another. For instance, my parents moved from the southern part of India to the western part, and the languages spoken there are very different. And my dad can speak like 6 or 7 languages all around like India, and he went to the Middle East as a young person too, so he speaks Arabic as well, which I think is slightly different from the South Asian languages. So it's just interesting, and he never really discusses his proclivity to pick up languages. He just said that he had friends around him that spoke the language, and he felt like it was nice to pick up, and that's why he picked it up. So I think it's very interesting how that movement can um, develop this process. And I really like how, Jada, like your understanding of learning, because one of the big themes of this particular interview is this idea of learning, right? And for me, I always think you always veer towards a method of learning that is both engaging but also very relatable to you. For instance, your passion for those documentary films early on in terms of how they presented information in such a beautiful, engaging way. But then also how you decided to think about learning languages in different contexts. You know, there was a real world application to learning a new language because you saw the result in terms of immediate communication. But also books, and I know like books are a great way to live a life that you have not lived until now, because you get to experience another person's perspective. And even travel, for instance, like you've moved from Florence, which is again like a tourist hub of the world, but you decided to move to Denmark for your Masters of Arts. And once you were done with that, you moved to El Salvador for an internship, and then jumped to Weston in London, Ontario. So I'm curious about the support of your family and the background of like some of your family members in terms of how they were able to encourage you. And also sometimes they say your parents' profession sometimes becomes the profession you take up, or it becomes the profession you never want to do, right? So I'm thinking about parental support in terms of choosing the career path you eventually chose, but also about um, what moving from one place to another did to you as an individual, and what were some of the things you learned along the way.
Yes, I think first of all, yes, without my parents' support, I wouldn't have gone very far. I
Mhm.
did work a little bit during my BA, but it would have supported me very little during my time in Denmark, also because it was, I mean, it is one of the most expensive countries in Europe. I couldn't work there because of the language barrier. So I'm always so grateful. My parents have really supported me. And I think I can speak on behalf of most people who are the youngest son or daughter in their families when I say that we have more opportunities than our older siblings. And honestly, every once in a while, I catch myself thinking, wow, if I'd been the oldest, probably I wouldn't have been given as many opportunities because by the time I was ready to move out, all my sisters were independent, they lived by themselves, and so my parents could support me a little bit more than they would have been able to do with them.
Mhm.
So, I think it's something that I really need to consider and appreciate. And so when I was in Denmark, yes, again, they really helped me a lot. Then, ever since I moved to El Salvador, luckily I've been able to rely on my own finances in Canada as well. But it's amazing how parents, they're so generous in a way that doesn't ask for reciprocity. They ask so little of you, and sometimes we cannot even give it to them because they're
Mhm.
always busier, we are living a fast-paced life, we don't have the patience, and I have moments where I'm like, oh my god, and I really need to train them properly or more often, and then life gets in the way. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that for those of us who are lucky enough to have parents that can support them, even sometimes just emotionally, not
Mm-hmm.
always materially. But it's been an interesting experience because Italian families are known to be very, tight knitted, and especially mothers have this reputation of being really attached to their children and have a hard time letting them go, which I think is pretty common. And especially now that I'm in Canada, whenever I'm in an international group of friends and people share, stories about their country, about relations, food, language, I feel like we're all pretty much the same. So I might hear something about, mothers in India being so protective and so like involved in your life, and I'm like, I think to different degrees I see that pretty much everywhere. So I had to actually step up for myself because my mom at the tender age of 24 didn't want me to go to El Salvador. She was almost about to forbid me because it's a very dangerous country, and every time we I bring up the topic, I'm like, if I'd listened to you, my life would have been very different, and I don't think it would have been better. So I appreciate your wisdom, but I try to follow more my father's attitude, in the sense of if something bad has to happen, it will happen anywhere and at any time. And same goes for good things. So I'm a little more laid back in that sense. But it's interesting because my parents are both really smart in the sense they have so many talents. Like they have very strong manual intelligence, both of them, which I sadly lack. And they're really skillful people, but they're not exactly maybe too into cultural activities, whatever that means. So I think it was interesting growing up because I had several friends telling me, oh, I didn't expect your family to be the way they are because you are so much into reading books, and you've always been that way. So somehow they expected me to come from maybe white collar kind of family, with my parents being highly educated. But my father didn't finish high school, my mother couldn't either, and back then it was also a bit of a gender issue where pretty much my grandfather preferred for my uncle to get an education. So it's not like centuries ago, but it's still, up to a few decades ago, there was a kind of attitude. So I could feel, especially with my mother, her desire to be more in school because she was good. She would have been, she would have probably gone to places. Her dream was actually to become, flight attendant because she always loved traveling. So it's just, sometimes sad to think about it. I might be able to live my dreams, but they really weren't. And they have other things that I don't in my life, obviously. But I think to know where you come from and then not be anchored and tied in a way that is constricting by it, it's good. I know that the sacrifices of my parents are invaluable. And so were the sacrifices of my grandparents. And probably mine will not go anywhere because of the current situation is just different.
Mhm.
When I talk to my sister, we always say that our grandparents created, our parents maintained, and we'll probably squander what is left because of you know not a callous attitude, but simply because it's not as easy to build things now
Mhm.
in many ways. And I think it's the typical millennial experience, and it will be the same for future generations, which it doesn't have to be all negative. There could be good things about it, but it's definitely incredible how the lifestyle of our grandparents or parents is so different from ours. And again,
Sure.
we're talking on the span of a few decades.
Yeah, yeah, and like that. It's amazing how, as children, we're so observant. And just in terms of picking up things in terms of our parents' personalities and attitudes, because they are the first adults we see growing up, right? And they become our model of who we think people in a particular gender should be like, because we are exposed to them so much growing up, and we pick up the good, we pick up the bad, but at the end of the day, we know that they love us, and we also realize that they're human in their own sense, right? They try their best, but they can also make mistakes, because when you're younger, you think sometimes, at least I thought, they were perfect, and then very soon that bubble burst. But I always knew that they came from a place of love. And in that sense, I know there may be difference as you grow up. Things change in terms of what you appreciate, what you used to appreciate growing up, and what you probably are engaging in now. But I know that you can always turn to them in terms of that support. But what about that change for you, Jada, in terms of moving to Denmark and Canada? Was it very different from Florence? And how did you handle that sort of change? I think you're quite good at it. Just in terms, I feel like if I put you in another country, you'll pick up a book, learn the language, and then find a way to assimilate into that culture. But I'm just curious, what is your process to get to like adjust to a new country?
I would say a little bit of research and documentation, first of all, just to get a sense of when I get there, what to expect and what to do.
Sure.
I That's even the way I travel for like vacation or else. I like to know my things so that I can be efficient with my time.
Yeah.
So definitely, even though it's amazingly 2 years apart when I moved to Denmark and then when I moved to Canada, but I was such a different person because obviously Denmark was the first obstacle to face. I was younger, was the first time, and again, the local language was in English. And so even though everybody spoke it pretty well, it's just not the same, even when trying to communicate and engage with people. So
Yeah.
it was tough at first. I didn't know anybody, and I actually, when I moved there by myself, I was looking for a place to stay because I wasn't able to find one from home in Italy, and I had serious difficulties. And I shouldn't be afraid of admitting it because I think it's normal, but actually, my parents came to rescue me basically because they were gonna go for a trip to Croatia and they have a camper,
Yeah.
and that's how they travel. And I asked them to come to Denmark and help me out finding a place and even
Wow.
with moving furniture because over there it's really rare to rent furnished places. So I already knew that if I was lucky enough to find a place, it would have been unfurnished, and very difficult weeks where I would go and see many places, but there was so much competition that you know. I was always told, oh, we picked someone else as a roommate. And I used to think, what if I cannot start my master simply because I don't have a place to stay? That would be
Yeah.
absolutely crazy. And probably now, with different kind of wisdom, I would have been more savvy on where to look. But I knew it was a difficulty shared by many. Several of
Mm.
my classmates actually they started a master still in hostels or Airbnbs while looking for places. The situation was that bad. But my parents, they came instead of driving to Croatia, they drove up north, and
Oh,
it's a 15-hour drive, which for Canadians it's nothing, but for Europeans, it meant to cross 3-4 countries, and luckily they had a camper, so it wasn't as bad. But they just came, and my mom asked
sweet.
me, why didn't you ask us in the first place? We'd have been happy to, drive. We could have taken a vacation out of it, help you, support you. And I told her I was too proud. I wanted so hard
To
to
do it on
become it.
your own.
Yeah, yeah. And then it turned out that I I couldn't, at least not completely.
Mm.
So, and they never made me feel guilty. They never, except the few jokes here and there. Like I remember I found some goggles in the camper. I was like, "Huh, why did you bring goggles?" And they were like, "Well, we were supposed to go to Croatia, to go swimming and stuff." And instead, I mean, you can in Denmark in the summer. The sea is actually beautiful, but it's really cold. So that's for the braves.
Yeah.
And when I went to Canada, it was a very different experience. I was able to find a place from Florence, so I landed and I was perfectly fine. The visa process went pretty smoothly, so that was also, a good thing. I already knew some people here in Canada, in London, in the university that I am enrolled in as a
Hmm.
PhD candidate. And again, speaking the local language helped a lot.
Yeah,
And so some of the difficulties I would say is the fact that it's not as diverse as I thought it would be, at least my program.
yeah,
So even making friends, it took me such a long time. In that way, I was actually able to make friends more quickly in Denmark because it was way more people from outside the country, so
mm,
more eager to establish bonds, to have a network of support.
sure,
So again, 2 years later, the experience was so much so much more, smooth. Like, yeah, some difficulties, obviously. I don't want to be one of those people that romanticize living abroad, like, oh, it's the best experience, and once you do and then you come back home for a vacation, you're always, like, I don't know why everybody doesn't do
do
it.
it.
And yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because yeah, I completely relate to that experience of moving to London, Ontario, because it was very different for me too. And making friends was a struggle at the start. And then I was in Mumbai before I moved there, and it was just a very different city, just in terms of the number of people that. And I think that's interesting, right? Like sometimes the most important things in our lives actually come out as a matter of luck or coincidence. It's not something we plan for, like off the top of our head. So that's pretty amazing to think about how the role of luck and chance in our lives. Jada, I know I want to be respectful of time. Is it okay if we go on for 5 more minutes
Of course,
in
yes, it
terms,
would
because
be a
I
pleasure.
Wonderful. I don't want to take too much time, but I'm just thinking about how you decided to jump into academia in terms of, because a lot of your interviews, and I read your bio, everyone knows about your academic background. You are a well-established PhD student, and you are in a project that has a lot of influence, but it's also something that is so important. I'm just curious about. Uh, what were the things that led you to make this decision about getting into academia after your MA? And what has that experience been like for you? Because a lot of students that watch this show, they would be thinking about their educational and professional paths. And we've not had anyone that has decided to pursue a more advanced study of a particular field that you have pursued for. Because I'm just looking at your research interests, and you say it's environmental communication, media activism, social movements, and access to information on environmental justice matters, with a particular focus on the Latin American region. So that's very specific and focused. So, how did this interest for academia come about? And yeah, sorry, I went on for a bit there, but go ahead.
No, not at all. I mean, you are basically able to draw a path for me to follow, to talk about my thinking process even behind the decision of joining academia, which again was much of a product of opportunities. I personally think that luck can only get you so far, but it's opportunities and the timing that are really of great importance. So even when someone says, oh, I got this maybe job position because I was lucky or whatever, and then maybe you got it because you were lucky, but you kept it because you were good at it. So when I met my supervisor in El Salvador, I was halfway through my master. I would have written my thesis, but masters in Europe tend to be a lot more professional than academic based as the one in Canada. And despite the fact I wasn't quite sure of what I would have done after my master was completed, and I was so afraid of going back to my previous stage, the one in between my BA and my MA, where yes, I was working, but it was again like temporary part-time jobs. They were not meaningful. They were not stimulating. So meeting my supervisor has been a game changer. There's no other way of describing it. She was able to steer me in the right direction. I never thought about doing a PhD. Frankly, I wasn't even sure what a PhD was actually. And she described the program and the kind of work I would have been able to do. And she has been so kind and supportive and engaged with me ever since. Uh, and we're talking about 4 years ago by now. And so I always say that my experience with academia is very different from other people, where they actively pursued academia. They wrote many applications to very different universities. For me, I was always meant to work with her.
Mm-hmm.
And the very first months actually of academia in my PhD, I remember feeling out of place, like I'm not like the others. I didn't dream of this for a long time. I didn't apply to many places. I don't belong. And some people kind of wanted to remind me of that, that like maybe I got into this particular program because I knew a professor. And then when I talked to my supervisor, she was like, a lot of people do that. A lot of people
Mm-hmm.
get recruited by professors during conferences or when they're doing field work, and that's how they begin a journey. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. And this is why I think, even though, again, timing and opportunity was essential. I know that my supervisors met a lot of students in their years, even when she was in El Salvador, and yet I was, able to follow up with that path, this academic path. And it's not because I'm better or luckier. I think some things just moved along the way, and I realized that I actually enjoy academia. And it's, again, a very different process, which is why I want to stress the fact that there is no right way of picking a profession or following a dream. Life has its own way of unfolding, and I think it's important, obviously, to follow some ideas, especially if you are very driven and determined towards one goal. But there's so much out there, and if you're open-minded and just flexible with opportunities, great things might come along the way. And because, again, I like to think of my experience abroad, especially in El Salvador, is the game changer, because it was my research interest, which I've always focused on environmental affairs. That's definitely been always a key area of focus of climate change, communication, and education as well. They went along the way of my internship first, and then the work that I've been doing in this project in El Salvador. So it's incredible, because among my many passions, I would say fine arts are probably the first. And as I was telling you, I really love history as well, and I like learning languages. So if I could, I would join a different program every few years. And it's uh, it's interesting where choices led me. And so I think there's always time to cultivate your own interest. But when it comes to academia, don't see it as a fence that you put around yourself, where everything that belongs to your research is of supreme importance, and nothing else can infiltrate or mutate it. Because I think we can find a lot of connections with different aspects. So my
Mm-hmm.
work, yes, it's in environmental justice and activism. Knowing many languages does help. And on the side, I can still pursue my interest and be pretty satisfied and well rounded, or at least I try. So I would want to really stress all these things I've been saying so far for young students. People are thinking of what's gonna be my learning story, my education path. There's so many that it's pretty much impossible uh, to count them. But definitely never think that you'll be done with learning. Like I think it's a given now. We've all accepted the fact that it's a really never-ending process, and along the way you might discover a sudden interest for something that you never considered in your life. And that's actually great, especially when you think back and you're like, my gosh, I've changed so much. I'm you know uh, different
Mm-hmm.
altogether. And that's a beautiful sensation.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great positive note to come to an end of this interview. I think one thing that I really enjoy about these interviews, Jad, is I get to learn a lot from the people I chat with. And I think something I'm taking away from this interview is that it's always important to keep learning and to be open to change, but also to be curious and to understand different situations and the opportunities and challenges they give you. They're just a way for you to grow and become a new person. And your journey shows us one path. And again, I think it's really inspiring for people that want to get into academia to know that, you know, it doesn't have to be so structured and fixed. You can find your own sort of niche in academia that's uniquely yours. And I think you have, I mean, it's obviously going to change in the future, and I hope, you know, you get there, and that passion for documentary filmmaking and languages is also integrated into everything you do. But thank you for sharing your story, and we really appreciate the time you've taken to do this. And for the listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Learning Stories. Stay tuned for more such interviews and for more such wonderful stories. Yeah, and keep learning.